The US government shutdown is heading for a second month, so could it stall the US economy? This is Macro Matters, and we're talking the shutdown. Historically, government shutdowns haven't bothered economists too much, but the length of this one has broken all precedents. This is the second month in a row when official jobs data hasn't come out, so it's hard to know what's happening in the labour market. Private data earlier this week showed a slight rebound in hiring, so while employers aren't adding many jobs, they also aren't laying off many people. But what if that signal is wrong? Mark Fleming is chief economist at First American. Mark, what do you think is happening under the hood of the US economy?
Well, you're absolutely right. Under normal circumstances, a shutdown, a short shutdown, a couple of weeks sort of a thing, there's really not a lot of impact on the US economy. But protracted shutdowns, and we are now in the longest one we've ever had, essentially is a modest demand shock. The government, we're basically not measuring the output of government workers. You also have the impact of outlays not being paid, sort of the SNAP programs and sort of welfare benefits not being paid. That's a significant one, and knock-on effects. And so you do begin to look, if it stays protracted, it is potentially increases unemployment and reduces GDP very modestly.
So what about the impact on the labour market? Of course, we have some private data, but that doesn't necessarily correlate in normal times with official payrolls, does it?
That's right. I mean, one of the primary private sources, ADP, was released this week, and so it is a point to look at. There are actually a number of other ones. There's business survey data. The Chicago Fed puts out an estimate of unemployment, which has actually remained stable for this month. So it's not that there is no data, but the benchmark government data is not there. And all of the private data sources are generally suggesting that there's no significant change in the sort of the softening trajectory of the labour market at the moment.
Well, Jerome Powell said on that lack of data that when you're driving in a fog, you should slow down. So how is the Fed looking at this? Is the December cut now off the table?
I suppose if you look at the betting markets, in the financial markets, there's almost 2/3 certain that there will be a rate cut. But your point is well taken. Lack of information creates increased uncertainty, and so maybe better to do nothing. Jerome Powell did make a very strong statement. Don't bet on anything with any certainty. Of course, they're looking at all these private sources as well. But the interesting thing, particularly with a shutdown, is it's a demand shock, right? So it sort of has long-term deflationary pressure because slower GDP growth. So you've got one thing benefiting your mandate of it helps sort of slow down inflation, but at the same time pushes unemployment modestly up. So they're being helped and hindered in a time when there's a lot of fog and you can't see well. So yes, it increases the likelihood that doing nothing is the safest course.
But what happens if when the shutdown ends, it turns out the labour market was weaker than it looked and jobs have been lost? Will the Fed turn out not to have moved quickly enough?
I mean, that's always the challenge for the Fed, even in times when there is no fog on the road, right? That they have sort of financial cuts or the time it takes for a Fed rate cut to make its way into the economy is 6 months to a year. So if we find out that it was worse than the sources that we have available to us after the government reopens, then it's sort of a hurry up and cut a little bit more. And so you would expect more pressure to cut faster early on next year. But that scenario seems relatively unlikely to begin with.
If they are feeling cautious for the moment, then that means higher rates for longer. What does that mean for the wider economy and the housing market?
Well, it's interesting, obviously credit card debt and auto loans, things that are influenced by the shorter rates that the Fed is much more able to influence, they would lose the benefit of a further rate cut if it were not to happen in December. But a lot of debt and the housing market in particular, obviously, are all sort of benchmarked to longer dated durations. And even we've seen in recent months, as the Fed has been cutting, the 10-year Treasury has really not moved away anywhere significantly from 4%. So I'm not inclined to think that there really is going to be much of a change, cut or no cut, by the Fed to certainly the housing market and mortgage rates, because we've already seen that there's not a lot of impact on longer dated duration bonds.
That was Mark Fleming of First American. Don't forget, you can watch more videos on Reuters.com.